This is video 5 of week 4 and the final one of the lesson. And let's now look at the schedule of multilingual language acquisition. And I'm going to be taking the monolingual one and the bilingual one in comparison for most of the time. Okay, so let's start with the phonetics and phonology schedule of acquisition. Bilingual infants can differentiate between their two languages at 4 or 5 months and even earlier, provided that the languages are very different, such as, for example, English and Tagalog, or slightly later than 4 or 5 months, so by 6 months, for similar languages such as English and Dutch. So this is the same as monolinguals, okay? So they recognize the differences between languages by 6 months, regardless of the differences among the languages in question. There are also no major differences in the time required by bilinguals and monolinguals to establish their phonemic repertoires, even though the bilinguals are in fact acquiring 2 sets of phonemes with less exposure, right? So it takes bilinguals the same amount of time to do double the work as monolinguals. Now, we don't know what monolinguals do with the extra time. And why don't they acquire their phonemic repertoires earlier in less time than the monolinguals acquired several phonemic repertoires? We suspect that it might be a matter of maturation of the brain. So probably when you're ready to build a phonemic repertoire, then it doesn't really matter whether you build one or you build more than one. You just build them. Period. You build as many as you need. Now, it is a bit surprising, though, because we know that less often occurring phonemes take longer to be acquired for monolinguals because there's fewer evidence. So it makes sense, right? So if you have fewer data, then it takes you longer to build a category. So that happens for monolinguals. So since multilinguals have fewer instances of a given phoneme, it is a mystery why it doesn't take them longer to build their phonemic repertoires, but the fact is that it doesn't, okay? So now, as for discriminating the languages, monolingual infants lose their ability to make phonemic discriminations not present in their language by 10 months. Whereas bilingual infants continue to distinguish between phonetic categories relevant to all languages for a little longer. And this is a difference, right? So whenever monolinguals just stop paying attention to differences between languages, bilinguals keep paying attention. It's almost like bilinguals think that they can never be sure that they have exhausted the amount of languages that exist in their environment. So they keep paying attention a little longer, just in case it becomes relevant and there's yet another language that they hadn't noticed at the beginning. So it's just one of the differences for the phonetics and phonology of multilinguals. Now, the way language discrimination is achieved is different in both groups. While monolinguals pay attention to familiar sounds, it looks like bilinguals pay attention to unfamiliar sounds, as you have read in the reading some hypotheses of why that might be. Now, both monolinguals and bilinguals, age 4 and 6 months, were able to discriminate. Now, the way language discrimination is achieved, as far as we know, is different for both groups. While monolinguals pay attention to familiar sounds, almost as confirmation of what they already know, bilinguals pay more attention, at least compared to monolinguals, to unfamiliar sounds, almost like still finding out whether new data is relevant, okay? While monolinguals think that new data is already relevant, what they care about is about confirming their categories. And this is just the difference also between monolinguals and bilinguals. And when I say data, I mean sounds of the language, of course. Another thing is that monolinguals and bilinguals, age 4 and 5 months, were able to discriminate people speaking French from those speaking English in this particular experiment in silent videos. So what that means is that it's not only the sounds, there are also some nonverbal cues or that have to do with movement of the mouth, for example, an expression of the facial expressions that are linguistically relevant. And they both discriminated French from English just by looking at silent videos of that. And this is very remarkable. Now, only bilinguals retain this ability by age 8 months. Again, just a little longer than the monolinguals. And again, you can click in this link that I include here when I'm done with the lecture to have a sense of what these experiments look like. Now, a couple of things about the lexicon, about how words themselves are acquired. So monolingual children learn word meaning using the mutual exclusivity heuristic through inference. And what that looks like is that normally they think that there is a form, there is a word, and the word corresponds to a meaning. If you say ball, then that is the object ball. And if you have a different word, so you have table, that would not refer to ball, that would refer to a different object. And that is something that monolingual children have understood. So whenever they encounter a new word, they will look for a new meaning. While 4 and 5 month old monolinguals pay attention. Now, 4 and 5 month old monolinguals pay attention to unknown words, unknown sounds, while bilinguals don't, because for them, this process that I explained to you before is not automatic, because one meaning can have more than one form. So the heuristic is not useful, right? So if you say you have a new word, that can actually mean a new object, but it can also mean a new label for a word, for an object that you already have, because it might be the label that that object has in a different language. Okay, so then the mutual exclusivity heuristic for multilinguals is just not that useful. Not automatic, the association with new word, new meaning, right? So they don't use it. They don't seem to use it to acquire new words. No. Now, what they do instead, how did they compensate for not having that resource, is unclear. Okay, but they actually do not use it. Okay, in any case, it does not affect their learning, since both monolingual and bilinguals know comparable amount of words. So they acquire the same amount of words, even though there is, in the multilingual case, there is a heuristic not being used, right? So even bilingual children know more words than they need for purely communicative purposes. So they acquire a huge amount of words, not only the ones that they need, but even more. And then we don't know how multilingual children compensate for not using inference. By the way, I put here a picture of Chaser, if you remember, the dog that knew 1,000 words, because Chaser too was able, experimentally, was able to learn new words using the mutual exclusivity heuristic, kind of treating humans as monolingual, if you want. And if you want to see what this looks like, just click on the link next to the picture, and then you will see an example of that. So Bialystok, for example, in seminal work, concludes that multilinguals or bilinguals might appear less masterful than a monolingual in either of the languages, but surely more extensive in their communicative possibilities than any monolingual. They seem to have more flexibility. Okay, when she says less masterful, that's very questionable, because we don't know whether she means in terms of size. Do multilinguals have fewer words in each of the languages, even though they end up with more words in general? That is actually still an empirical question. Shall we count the words that a child has separately for each language? Shall we combine the number of words in all languages and count those words, even though they would be the same word with two different sounds, if you want? Shall we actually measure the conceptual coverage of those words? Do they have words for the same concepts in either one of the languages or in both languages combined than a monolingual child? Or shall we actually measure words according to the linguistic sophistication of the words? Are they able to do compound words, derive words, and so forth? So in measuring the lexicon of children in general and then multilingual children, there are many questions and very few answers. The conclusion, though, seems to be that all of these things are hard to prove because there is huge variability across children with respect to vocabulary. There is more than to respect to any other linguistic aspect. So then it's very difficult to test because one child differs in this respect a lot from another child. Now, it might be the case that multilinguals have smaller vocabulary in either of the languages independently, but more communicative fluency, more flexibility, and larger total vocabulary. But this seems to be the case, but still is to be definitely proven. And this is in part because we do not have good tests to measure these kinds of things. We're talking about very small children and before school age. So the test will have, when you're talking about counting, the test will have to be adapted to their reality, and that is very hard to make, and also, in fact, of questionable significance. So how about the syntax development of the multilingual children? So the predominant view regarding the way that children learn the structure of two languages is that it is parallel to that found in monolingual children in each of the languages. So children in learning two languages understand the difference between the two systems and learn the structure of each in much the same way that the corresponding monolinguals. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be very marked differences there. There is evidence of continuous interaction of the language systems, that for sure, which causes language contact phenomena. So it might be that because the languages, the grammars interact with each other, it might look like the children have different, they make more mistakes, if you want to call that. So they may have different intermediate stages from the one that they will end up with, but pretty much the development in syntax, as you have read in the readings, pretty much there are no differences between the two of them. This issue of the contact phenomena is very important, and it does not belong to this block, but it actually, in the multilingualism class, when we look at the linguistic effects of multilingualism, then we will be looking at what that means. But here, what is relevant for you to keep in mind is that it might well be that multilingual children have different grammars from monolingual children of those different languages, and that's because, of course, grammatical systems interact and they cause some effects, some linguistic effects. Okay, but whenever we talk about the development of multilingual children, we have to kind of adapt our assessment to those multilingual children, because look at what happens when this is not controlled. So this is just a random quote from a study of English Spanish multilinguals in Miami. Okay, so the authors conclude something like this: for all these structures, the syntactic structures that they have studied, the bilinguals lag behind their monolingual peers in learning the correct syntactic forms. The older children were performing better that is more like monolinguals than the younger ones. And the amount of the relevant language to which the child was exposed was positively related to progress. Okay, but here look at this correct and performing better and more like monolinguals. That means the older children are more like monolinguals. They have learned to differentiate their two languages and to control for any of the interferences or any of the interactions between the two grammars more than the younger children. But better is a relative thing. Better just means that more like monolinguals, as you can have here. So this is a very formalist perspective in which you take an atomistic look at the structures of these children, at the linguistic production of these children, and you decide the monolinguals are the ones who speak the best. And then what you're comparing is not how well multilinguals speak, but how similar to monolinguals multilinguals speak, right? But this is just might be very problematic when you evaluate the linguistic performance of children. Fortunately, these authors actually recognize what their parameters are, and they also continue saying, well, in all cases, the progression, the syntactic progression, the acquisition of the syntactic structure was the same, and the structures were learned in the same manner and in the same order, both in monolinguals and bilinguals. The difference was that children learning two languages took longer to learn the subtleties of syntax than did children concentrating in only one language, and that the more exposure the child had to that language, the more quickly the structures were incorporated. So, in fact, both children arrive at the same place in following the same schedule. And well, after all, remember, once the differences level out, which they do, the bilinguals end up with two languages, while monolinguals end up with one language. So in sum, they follow the same structure, right? And they arrive at the same absolute places, in the sense that they end up speaking at equal exposure. They end up speaking at the same level, the bilinguals in each one of the languages as the monolinguals in their own language. But of course, the difference is that monolinguals end up with one language, while bilinguals end up with two languages. So what is the conclusion of all this? And here I'm just summarizing things that you should be reading about in your in the articles that I gave you. So learning or restructuring a language or variety takes time, and yet the child is often tagged as semilingual or alingual before he or she has had the time to adjust to the new language environment. So remember, it just takes time to acquire a language, and there's no need to cut the process of acquisition at a given point and give such a vicious label as semilingual or alingual when the child is in the process of acquiring both languages. Okay, so time is a critical factor as need and motivation, and we should keep in mind that half the world's population is bilingual, and that using the monolingual as a yardstick is questionable. Okay, so we should, in this comparison, be very careful. Be very careful of taking monolinguals as the perfect case or the perfect scenario of acquiring language, because they are the minority, right? So why, according to what, they should be made as the norm? Then assessment of multilingual children's linguistic skills should include understanding their language experiences, and we need more sensitive tests, a more graduated approach to proficiency, and caution in generalizing. Language acquisition theory should incorporate both linguistic competence, like the formal theories, the atomistic approaches, and communicative competence, which is more like the functionalist, the communicative approaches. We don't have those tests. Now, vocabulary assessments are inclusive due to variability. Vocabulary needs learning, not just triggering. okay? And syntactically, there is cross-linguistic influence, yeah, in the case of multilinguals. Multilinguals lag behind in structures, if you may, but the sequence of acquisition is the same as monolinguals, and it levels out with exposure and time. They end up in the same place, given that the exposure is also controlled for, and given that they're given more time, okay? Well, a final note, this presentation is on Nestor. Please do the homework by next Wednesday, and see you at seminar.